Hi, welcome to Smeester's Corner. I'm Adam Smeester. Today's topic is how to have productive disagreements in conversations. Everybody can benefit from this. Everything that I'm going to say today comes from the book How to Have Impossible Conversations from James Lindsay. So it's a very good book. It goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about some things that I got from the book that I hope can help people have productive conversations with people with whom they disagree. So before we get into the conversation part of it, we're going to talk about the approach to the conversation. There are 4 things that you need to realize when you go into a conversation with a person with whom you disagree. The first approach is you need to have a goal for a conversation, especially one like this, where you're having it with someone with whom you disagree. The goal should be to understand, not necessarily agreement. So there's a difference between understanding versus agreement. You don't have to have agreement at the end of the conversation. Your goal should just be to understand the other person and for them to understand you. And you can say that even at the beginning of the conversation. Hey, I just want to understand where you're coming from, and I want you to understand where I'm coming from. We don't necessarily need to agree by the end of this. If you do that, disagreements can be taken down a notch instead of, people getting very upset. If you understand that you're just trying to understand versus agree. Also understand that understanding another person isn't accepting what they're saying. So some people think that if you just sit there and listen, that's platforming them, and that's a form of accepting what they're saying. And if you disagree with it, if it's bad enough what they're saying, you need to deplatform them, you need to cancel what they're saying or whatever. That's not very productive either, because you never make societal changes through force. By forcing people to try to agree with you or forcing them to shut down what they're saying, that usually never works. And especially in a one-on-one conversation, that never works. Number 2 is understand that you are not a teacher. So don't act like the teacher and the other person's the student and you're just up there spouting off what you have to say and they just have to listen to you, and by the end they're going to have an agreement with you, and that's going to be the understanding. This never works. The reason it never works is because you're speaking to your values and you're not speaking to their values. To understand what their values are, you need to listen and understand. Number 3 is huge. Don't assume because they disagree with you that they're a bad person or they come from a place of having bad motivations. Don't assume that they just want bad outcomes. The last approach is you need to understand what confirmation bias is. Confirmation bias is when a person has a predetermined conclusion and then they look for evidence to support their conclusion. This is the way most people think. However, most people think that they look at facts, they look at statistics, and they look at science, and then that helps them arrive at a conclusion. That's not the way it works. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, says people come to emotional conclusions based on how they feel about an issue, and then they use logic, reason, and facts to justify those feelings. That's how most people think. And just because you're smart doesn't mean that you won't come to use confirmation bias. Some of the smartest people I know use confirmation bias all the time. Typically, the smarter a person is, the more likely they might be to use confirmation bias because they think that they're right, and they will do less listening to understand because they just think that they're right because they're smart. The other form of confirmation bias is when a person uses their conclusions to determine what their conclusions say about them. So here's an example. We'll use the name of John as the person who's disagreeing with you. So they might think good people think X. John is a good person. Therefore, John will believe X. Then John will look for facts and evidence and reason to support his belief in X. The conclusion will be that John feels like the search for facts and evidence is a result of him believing X. And that's how it works. Once you understand confirmation bias, your frustration in a conversation with someone with whom you disagree will probably go down because you know where their disagreement might be coming from. And if they're not acknowledging your facts and opinions, you might understand why. All right, now we're going to discuss what you do when conversing with someone with whom you disagree. how to make it productive. There's a bunch of strategies. I'm just going to start listing them off. Here we go. Find common ground first so that they're not defensive. When a person feels defensive, they dig their heels in. You don't want them to feel defensive. So to get someone to not feel defensive, find common ground first, not disagreement first. If you find disagreement first and just say, yeah, I disagree with that, they're going to dig their heels in. When you say, hey, yeah, you said X, I actually agree with you on whatever it is that they said, okay, that will help them feel not as defensive. Next, find out how much they know about the subject. This is going to come in the form of questioning them. When you start questioning them, they might realize that they didn't know as much about this subject as they thought that they did, because they might have a tough time answering all of your questions. So you can question them to start making them question themselves. You're not going to prove them wrong, but they may prove themselves wrong. This is called the illusion of explanatory depth. I'll repeat that. This is called the illusion of explanatory depth. This is when a person believes that they understand things better than they thought they did. And by you questioning them, this might bring that to light. This is a very good strategy. I've used this a lot. The next strategy is reverse the conversation. If you ask somebody a direct question and they don't give you a direct answer, they either sidestep it, they change the subject, or in some cases they may get mad, so they just start calling you names, because the answer to your direct question will undermine their conclusion or undermine their position. So they don't want to answer it. In a conversation like this, you can model and you can say, all right, I just asked you this. You did not answer my question. How about you ask me that question? And then you let them ask you the question, and then you give a direct answer. And then you say, all right, now you try it. You don't want to come off as condescending, but this can help the conversation progress if they're refusing to answer direct questions. The next strategy is cancel defensiveness. You don't want them to feel defensive. The words that you use might help cancel how much defensiveness they feel. So for example, you can use the word we instead of I. So instead of saying I disagree or I think this, you can say we think blah, 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 and we think blah, blah, blah. Okay, that might help distract from the one-on-one feeling that they're getting. Instead of using the word you when talking to them, you can use the word some. Some people would say this and this and this, and I would say blah, blah, blah. Instead of saying, well, you say blah, 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 and I disagree with that, and I think whatever. So use the word some instead of you. Instead of saying, yeah, I disagree, you can say, yeah, I'm skeptical of blah, blah, blah. If you just say, I disagree, it's going to make them defensive. The last one is when they make an assertion, instead of saying, yeah, but, you can say, yes, and. Instead of saying, yeah, but, blah, blah, blah. My students do this all the time. You can say, yeah, and then give your response. The next one is called the point scale. So when you're having a discussion with someone that you disagree with, they may be a little intellectually arrogant, and they may be really dug in. To get them to be a little less arrogant, you can use the point scale. So when you start the conversation, you can say, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sure are you of your belief? Most people won't go to a direct 10 because that makes them look like they're really arrogant. They might say a 7 or 8, and then the fact that they said 7 or 8 might make them a little less arrogant. So you can start off the conversation like that too, to kind of tamper it down before it gets heated. If they do say 10, you might want to reconsider, is this conversation even going to be worth it? The next one is called outsourcing. So if they make an assertion, you can outsource or ask them for sources and say, hey, who are the best experts that agree with you on this? Chances are they probably have no idea. They might, but chances are they probably don't. Most high school kids and a lot of college kids will have no idea. Maybe they do have some sources. Okay, then you can ask them, who are the best experts who disagree with you? That most certainly they don't know. This can humble the conversation a little bit because chances are they just heard something, they heard the assertion somewhere, they agreed with it, now they're just repeating it, which happens most of the time. But this can help humble the conversation a little bit. The next one is called alter casting. So think of the word casting like in a movie where you cast someone and you give them an identity for a movie. This is alter casting, where you're giving them the opposite identity of maybe how they're coming across. So you're giving them an identity in the conversation so they don't get too combative with you. So you can say before the conversation starts, hey, I know that you care a lot about X. and you seem like a really reasonable, open-minded person. So what do you think, or what do you have to say about X? And just the fact that you gave them that identity that they now have to live up to and fill the shoes of somebody who is open-minded and reasonable. So they may change their behavior than what it otherwise might have been to try to fill that role that you just gave them. The next one is you can ask them for disconfirmation. So in any scientific argument that involves facts, logic, science, there's going to be some sort of disconfirmation. So some hypothetical scenario that, if proven, could disconfirm what another person says, right? So take global warming, for example. If you believe in global warming or you're a global warming skeptic, there hypothetically could be some sort of information that hypothetically could come out to disconfirm that. Or maybe someone has a social thought that they think that all cops are bad. Well, is there any information that could disconfirm what they think? This is really effective. I've used this and it really works well. So I've asked a person before, hey, is there any information that could hypothetically disconfirm what you're saying? If they say no, then you might want to reconsider why you're having the conversation to begin with. But most people are going to be that arrogant. So you can ask them for disconfirmation, and then you can have a conversation about what might disconfirm that, and then that might help tamp down the conversation, lead it in a different direction, to help a person kind of get off their high pedestal if they know it all. All right, the last one, this is the most important. You can, at the end of the conversation, because you're not aiming for agreement, you're aiming for understanding, you can let somebody be wrong. That's okay. If they don't agree with you at the end of the conversation, that's okay. If you did get mad and maybe you did insult or you stepped over the line, you can apologize. That might help tamp down the conversation. That might help them to want to apologize as well. But it's stupid to let your relationships, your friendships or whatever, get affected by political or other sociocultural differences because of the way that you see the world. People are going to see the world differently than you do. That doesn't make them a bad person. Maybe you just say to yourself, all right, I think that they have reasoned their way into a false moral view, but that's also my opinion. And it's okay if I think that they have a false moral view. That might not be mine, but that doesn't make them a bad person. Maybe they just have an error in their reasoning. You can let other people have errors in their reasoning. That's called humility. Your social group doesn't have to be just like you and think the way that you think and have all the beliefs that you believe. You need to have some people in your life who think differently than you do. That helps you give you a perspective on how life works and the different opinions that people have and the way people operate and the way people's brains think. That's okay. These are just some tips that I've read about that I thought were very helpful. Again, this comes from the book How to Have Impossible Conversations by James Lindsay, and they get into a lot more detail than I did. So if you don't pick up the book, at least hopefully this helps. So thanks for watching.